Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Is there audio going? Hello? Is there any audio recording? Can anybody hear me? All right. Still hear me now? Awesome. Okay. So I just got to figure out how to share this link to the invite, and then we'll be good to go. So hello, everybody. Those of us just joining in. Welcome to my live painting demonstration tonight. In case you all didn't see the post, Steve Martin won the poll, so that's what I'm going to be painting. The photo I'm going to be working from, you can actually see in the invite. There's like a post for it. So I'm going to take just a minute here. I'm going to go over some of the things like I got going on. If I can reverse my camera. There we go. So this is my palette. So I've got alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, chromium oxide green, which I'm probably not going to use for this, cadmium yellow light, burnt umber, burnt sienna, ivory black, and titanium white. Those are the colors I'm going to be using. I probably won't be using most of those. Some of them are left out from another painting I did earlier this week. All right, it's a little difficult for me to keep up with the chat because I have to sort of turn around and I need to be looking at my canvas, but I'll do my best. Hopefully you all will be able to hear me and see what I'm doing. I'll keep looking back every now and then if you have any questions. I'll try to answer as best I can. So tonight I'm painting Steve Martin, one of my favorite comedy icons. This is a sort of a fun piece to do. I like the arrow through the head. So I'm going to start this out with just a loose sort of underdrawing. I'm just taking some burnt umber and I'm thinning it down with some mineral spirits. I'm just going to do a loose sketch, figure out where in the composition I want this to be. There we go, it's a little better. Let's see. I'm going to put him, I need to make sure I have enough room for this whole arrow. So I'm just going to start by drawing a line for my arrow. It goes like angle. There we go. Now I make sure that when I place his head, I'm not going to be squeezing a short little arrow in there. All right, so I'm going to put his eye. That's a little too dramatic. That's better. So when I paint, I like to have my brush in one hand and a rag in the other. It's like the closest thing to having an eraser. So the canvas I'm working on is just sort of a store-bought canvas, acrylic gesso primed. I tinted it a little earlier today. I don't like working on a pure white canvas. Like, that white is just so overpowering. So I put a very thin layer of burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And then I actually wiped most of it off, so it just left nice tint on there, so I don't have that bright white surface. I found that if a surface is really like that white of the gesso is showing through, I have a tendency to like raise the key of my painting and make everything way brighter than it has to be, because I'm trying to keep up with it. So putting a little tint on there helps me control my values a little bit. So I'm just very loosely kind of blocking in where I want the head to be. Getting the shape right, finding where in the composition is going to be. Make sure it fits nicely on the canvas. That's a little small. We can go bigger than that. Here we got some eyebrows. I'm not getting too caught up on details, really. I just want to make sure that the placement is right, basic proportions are right. Things like the top of the hair, where that stuff is going to be, that can be kind of loose because it tends to move around a lot as I paint. Forehead up just a little bit. Probably go even higher than that. Place the mouth on there. So hello to everybody who's just joining. As I peek back, I see little names popping up on the screen. Welcome everybody to my first live streaming painting demonstration. Something I've been thinking about doing for a while, but now is sort of the opportunity to actually do it, I suppose. Thank you, everybody who voted in the poll. I thought, kind of a fun thing to do, and I didn't have to make the decision myself. So I picked a few paintings that I wanted to do anyway, let you all figure it out. Now here I am with Steve Martin, arrow through the head. Hello, everybody. For those of you just joining in, I'm using just really thinned out burnt umber, just doing a very loose drawing. So I've got this paint thinned out almost as thin as watercolor. So I can just do real loose drawing, and then I can erase little pieces if I want to. So move this so I can get the bottom. The easel's got this little line here, this little like ledge that helps keep the canvas in place, but it means I sometimes neglect the bottom of my canvas. To make a point, be careful. I actually paint this stuff in. If you look through a lot of my paintings, the bottom of them, you'll see like a little ridge here sometimes where the paint stops because of the edge on the easel. Yeah, I thought about part of the reason why I chose men specifically for this poll is because, to be perfectly honest, like men, especially if they have like real pronounced faces and like a lot like really angular faces, they're way easier to paint, and so it goes a lot faster. So for a 2-hour demo, that's why I chose for this one. But next time, there's all kinds of people I want to paint. Yeah, but with you get somebody like if they say it's a very young child, or if it's like a woman with very smooth skin, there's a whole lot of nothing to paint, and that can be really difficult. It's sort of it's a lot easier for things to go wrong. Whereas if somebody's got like angles and sort of like wrinkles and stuff like that, it gives you something to hold on to, and it helps make the likeness look a little more accurate. What would be a good? The image I'm working from is actually in the invite, in the discussion section. I've got the picture I'm working from is there. I could probably actually put it in the comments of this post. That won't take very long. Give me 1 second. Looks like it's not going to let me do it. If you check the invite, like the invite page, it shows the picture there. Hopefully I'll do such a good job that you won't even need the photo, but we'll see about that. That seems ambitious for 2 hours. So I've got kind of the head is placed where I want. I can probably reinforce that arrow. That arrow might be a little short. No, that's good. That's perfect. What am I talking about? It's exactly how long it needs to be. I'm not worrying about making a perfectly straight line yet. I'm not even really painting the arrow yet. I'm just placing it. Keeping everything loose and sketchy, nice and thin. Okay. Do just a little block in that shoulder just a little bit more. There we go. So that is about as much drawing as I'm going to do. That's enough for me to build the rest of the painting on. Like, this is not perfect. Nothing is necessarily defined as where it's going to be, but it gives me a nice structure that I can work with. A lot of this is sort of like notes for myself. Like, a lot of these little lines are going to be painted over, but they're a note for me that when I start blocking in shadows and stuff like that, like where some of those lines are. It's almost like, at this stage, it's less like painting and it's more like writing shorthand for myself. Just taking notes so that when I go in with paint, I'll have some idea of how things are worked out already. I don't have to keep that all juggled in my mind. All right. And yeah, now I think I'm ready to move on to some painting. So I'm going to take this nice, kind of fairly big brush. So I guess is maybe, I don't know, inch and a half. It's definitely got frayed out as I've used it. And I'm going to start blocking in the background first. I always like to do the background color first because that's going to affect how the entire thing looks. Like whatever colors, whether black or green or whatever color is back there, it's going to have a big effect on how all the colors in the rest of it look. So I like having that background in as the very first thing, and it helps me sort of set the tone. So I'm not using pure black, even though there's black on my palette and that black background on the photo. But for something like that, I prefer to mix my own black. I think it looks a little bit, has a little more depth, a little bit richer. So what I'm doing is I'm mixing alizarin crimson with ultramarine blue, so it's a very dark purpley black. And I'm thinning it out, not as much as I thinned out that burnt umber in the last step. I don't want it as thin as watercolor, but thin down to maybe like kind of melted butter. And I'm going to start just around the head, sort of blocking in this background. And I paint over the edges a little bit, even though like I marked that stuff off, I'm painting over them. Because I want to have some wet paint that I can work into. So as I start working on the hair and all those other things, it'll all like, I can paint into that wet paint and it'll make a nice soft edge, which will help it look more realistic, make it look more like fitting into the background, so it doesn't look photoshopped on. Real loose, real messy. I like keeping this stage especially messy. A lot of the stuff gets covered up, but sometimes that messiness shows through in the final painting, and I think that can look really nice when you have kind of a controlled chaos going on underneath the surface. I'm sort of shaping the edges a little bit. I'm sort of working on the drawing and refining it a little bit. You know, like cutting in over this burnt umber to try to get these angles right on, say, underneath the chin, the jaw. I can paint over the arrow. Some of that's going to move around. The arrow is going to be one of the final things I do, probably. Shoulders a little short. Should be all the way up there. That's better. That looks more like it. And so I'm going to kill some of this background color. What I'm doing is I'm really just kind of scrubbing this color a little bit. The official technical term for that is scumbling, but it's really just scrubbing. This is why my brushes look frayed, but there's really no other way of getting certain kinds of marks other than just sort of harming your brushes. Okay, so I got the background in. I'm not going to paint the whole background, just enough like around the face so that when I start making assessments of color, like the temperature of the color, how light or dark the colors are, having this background in place around the face is going to be really helpful for me to make those decisions. And the other thing that's going to make a huge, huge difference is going to be that suit. That bright white suit is going to have a huge effect on how all these colors read. So I'm going to block that in. But I'm not going to use pure white. I never use pure white. It always looks sort of flat. But I am going to use a very pale gray. And I'm not going to go as bright as I want it to be. I want to save like the lightest lights for my very end. But I want to get something in there that's going to show me that it's high value, that's going to sort of fill the place of that white in there so that I can look at the rest of my painting and make some good decisions. Let's see, how's that? A little bit darker. There we go. All right, so I'm going to block this in. And so you can see how light that looks. It's the lightest spot on the canvas, but this is like maybe a couple steps down from pure white. It's not quite like it's the brightest thing on there, so I'm sure it reads as pure white on the video. But it's actually a little bit darker than it seems. But that's good, because it helps me build contrast later. I'm not super worried about getting all the wrinkles right or anything like that. I'm just trying to get the major color shapes in there. Like I want it to be, you know, fairly accurate, but like you can see over here where this is all like sort of loose. So that's all stuff that I can fix later. This is the secret of oil paint ultimately, is that it stays wet for a really, really long time. So you can just leave stuff, let it sit. Yeah, it's still about the consistency of thinned out butter. it looks a little different because the white is so opaque, but it is like thinned out to the same level as sort of the background is. And there's a little bit, a little darker. So there's those little shadow areas on the collar, and I want to make sure I get those in too. And they don't need to get much darker than that, that light gray that's there. Like just a little bit of a jump will be enough to make it look, darker. And I can always go back in, add more darks and highlights later. I just need to get the general mode of it right. There we go. And then that tie, that red tie, I'm going to put just block that in a little bit with sort of a alizarin crimson and maybe some of this burnt sienna. It's got a little bit of an orange quality to it. The alizarin crimson is very purple sort of red. It's pretty versatile, but it has a purple bent, so if you want something that looks a little more orangey, I could either do yellow or I could do the burnt sienna. Let's see how the burnt sienna looks. That looks nice. A little spot of white. It's a little dark still. All right. A little dark, but that's okay. I like putting my darks in first and then building shadows on top of them. So if it's a little darker than it's eventually going to be, that is totally fine. It's not perfectly worked out. Like I'm still using this nice big brush. Details don't have to be perfect yet. A lot of this stuff is going to be covered up. This is almost like if you were building a building, if you built the scaffolding first. And this is kind of the intense scaffolding. There's not really paint on it. Like it's not really painting yet. So now we're going to block in the hair. Again, for the same reason I did the background first and then the suit. The hair is going to help me make informed color decisions about the skin, which is going to be the hardest and sort of, most varied area. But also, in general, I like working from the background to the foreground. It's part of making something look realistic, in a painting is having soft edges, like where things aren't really all well that defined in reality when we look at them. Like you can find where something ends, but you're just looking around. There's not like a outline drawn around things. Like in reality, things like have soft curves and things like hair, sort of the fluffiness sort of like tapers off. And so to make this look real and make it look like a real person in a real environment, and that like they belong together, you like to keep everything very, very soft in those early stages. And so getting that hair nice and soft worked in, that's my next step. So I'm using a little bit of the ivory black, some white, and then a little bit of the burnt umber, because while Steve Martin has famously gray hair, even at this point, it sort of has a little bit of a light, like a brownish quality to it. It's not quite as gray as black and white gray would be. You can find my art currently on my Instagram page, which is just Joe Granski. I need to update it a little bit, or you can just contact me. I can give you links to anything. I also have a fan page that I haven't really kept up with in a while, but that's on the agenda. And I do offer art classes. That's kind of what prompted me to do this in the first place, is I've been doing some online streaming classes, or not streaming, but some online classes with some private students, and it's gone really well. This is all sort of, doing it digitally is sort of new, and I wasn't sure quite how it would work out, but it's been really enjoyable and really successful. And so I want to see if I can really share this out with people. If anybody's interested, let me know. I do all ages, adults, children. It could be painting, drawing. There's a whole world of different arts that I'd be happy to help you learn. Okay, so I'm going to really get this edge nice and soft. Where all the darker parts of the hair. Okay, now there's that really light part. And the light part, the shadow areas have got that warm kind of gray to it. But the really white part is a little bit cooler. So I'm going to use a little bit less of the burnt umber and a little bit more of the black and white. And being a little bit different temperature, being a little bit cooler, it'll make it look more like actual light, you know, like an actual object, you know, that is responding to light. Let's just get these big shapes. They don't have to be perfect. I'm going to smooth some of this stuff out here in a little bit anyway. But get them in place, get the colors there. There we go. Now he's got those really couple little dark spots that I'm going to put in that hair. And it's just the same colors I've been using, just changing the ratios a little bit. Some artists like to really pre-mix all their colors. Like I've seen, especially when I see people do demos on YouTube and stuff like that, I see a lot of people mix all the colors that they're going to need like right before they even get started. I mean, it almost looks like a palette from Photoshop or something. But I've always been, like, I'm sure that's really helpful for people, but I've always been way more freestyling with it. I like mixing my colors on the fly. I like changing them up. You know, I like every time I bring the brush back, I like there to be a slightly different color. I think that just makes it look so like more interesting and impressionistic. So I just go wild with my mixing my colors, and there's a lot of trial and error and a lot of wasted paint, unfortunately. But this is the technique that I've taught myself over the years. In a future video, I'd like to have like maybe 2 cameras set up, and I could actually like have a camera on the palette so you could see what I'm doing. Like that would take a little bit more editing, but I think that would be really helpful. Because I can tell you what I'm doing, but sometimes actually watching the colors mix can be valuable as well. So hello to anybody just joining in. Welcome to my live painting demo. Okay, so now this is what I'm going in now with just pure burnt umber, still thinned out. And I'm going to get this nice big, you know, where the arrow is going through, there's this almost long teardrop sort of shape. And then we've got these darks under the ear. All right, so now I'm ready, I think, to start working on some skin. I've got enough of these colors blocked in the background. I kind of know how the colors are going to react, so now I can start working on the face itself. And so I'm going to start like with some darker shadow areas. I'm going to take some burnt sienna and a little bit of the burnt umber to make a nice kind of hot brown sort of color. It's like I like having warm shadows and cool highlights, so I'm using very hot colors to get these early shadow areas blocked in. And I'm not worried about details, I'm not worried about features. What I'm worried about is like the larger shapes. If you were to like say print out this photo and then take, you know, a pair of scissors to it and like cut along like the jawline and cut along the area of the cheek. Imagine if you looked where the color changes, where it's darker on one side, lighter on the other. And imagine if you were to cut along that line, like those sort of puzzle piece shapes. That's what I'm looking for in my composition. And I'm start with a few dark spots, like these shape, like the shape of the eye socket. So I'm not, for example, I'm not painting the eye. Like I'm not going to really work on the eye much, except sort of incidentally for a while. But I am going to focus on the eye socket. You know, this. You know, 70% of a human likeness is going to be in this triangle right in here. Like the brow and down into the nose. Because those parts, you know, you think about it, like you can see somebody at 5 years old, at 15 years old, at 50 years old, with 100-pound weight fluctuation between them, and you can always recognize the people. You know, you can even recognize them across the street maybe. And the reason for it is this area right in here. The eye sockets, the bridge of the nose, this is all like bone, you know, like the brows, the nose, that's hard, that's bone, and that doesn't change much over the course of your life. Whereas things like lips, the tip of the nose, ears, and all those other things, that's all soft tissue, and as you get older, it changes size and shape and all that. But this area right here doesn't change much. So if you want to get an accurate likeness of somebody, this is the area you got to focus on. You want to get the outline of the face right, and then this triangle first. And if you don't get those two things right, nothing you can do will make it look like the person you're trying to get it to look like. But knowing that is actually really helpful, because then you know not to waste your time on things that aren't going to be very helpful. So those are sort of my darkest spots on the flesh. So now I'm going to do, like you can see at the bottom of the jaw, like in the neck, there's that really like orangey kind of color, like those of you who are looking at the photo. So I'm going to start with that color first. I'm going to take alizarin crimson and some of the cad yellow, maybe a spot of black. Like I have the ultramarine blue on my palette, but because I want my shadows to stay really warm, I'm going to use black instead of blue in the shadows and use the blue only in the highlight areas, and that will cool the colors and make it look more like natural light. It's just kind of the way light works. The shadow temperature is going to be the opposite of the light temperature. So if you have warm light, you're going to have cool shadows. If you have cool light, you're going to have warm shadows. So part of the way like I help myself stick to that is I'll use blue in the highlights and not in the shadow areas. I'm also not using much white, or any white actually, in the shadow areas just yet. I may a little bit later, but white has a tendency to sort of, it's very opaque, and so I like having my shadows like very like thin and transparent, and so I try not to use white if I can help it. So I try to lighten with like other colors, mixed colors that are a little bit lighter in value. That's not too bad, that's pretty close. Okay, so I'm going to get this shape of the whole bottom of the jaw, this whole shadow area. That's maybe a little warm, but it's okay, I can fix that as I go. It's a good starting point. Then it's kind of around here as well. The paint is still pretty thin, and this is all very loose, just kind of blocking in. Okay. Now I'm going to do kind of the larger, more highlight area of the face. So like in my head, what I've kind of done is broken it down into like 3 sections. I've got the shadow section, and there's two kind of, there's a midtone and there's sort of a highlight. I'll do the midtone section next. And that I'll start using some white in there. It's very light, very orangey sort of color. How does that look? Ooh, that's way too orange. A lot of trial and error with color mixing, but that's half the fun for me. I like swizzling my brush around, making a mess. That's half the point. That's a pretty good color. How is that? Yeah, I think that'll work. It's a little light. I can darken that just a little bit. You have to resist. Like I find that I need to resist some of the temptation to go as bright as I possibly can, especially in these early stages. Same thing I was talking about earlier with the with that white background. Like I have a tendency to make the key very, very high, and so if everything's really, really bright, then nothing will look all that bright. It'll just look washed out. So to compensate for my natural tendency to sort of boost things up that way, I make myself go a little bit darker, especially in these middle stages. I am in Ithaca, New York. I have been painting, like oil painting, since I was 18, so I'm 41 now, so almost 25 years. I've been doing art ever since I can remember. You know, I think everybody does visual art at some point in their life, and most people give it up at some point, and I'm just one of the people that never gave it up. I think that's sort of the difference between an artist and other people's. We just don't stop doing it. There we go. Yeah, I like that color. And so, like, my drawing, like, in those early stages was imperfect. So I can go back and fix some stuff. I don't have to be married to those lines I first put down. I'm just using one brush. I've been using just this big, this 1.5 inch, like, it's actually even an acrylic brush, like with those short bristles, but it doesn't really matter that much. But so I'm just using that and just using for like majorly blocking in. I at least want to get most of the canvas covered with this big brush and get as much of it painted as I can with this big brush before I move on to a smaller one. The temptation is always to start just like really messing with all the little details and getting really hung up on them. And you know, if you like perfectly render an eye, like the most perfectly painted eye anybody's ever painted, but it's an 1.5 inches too low, then your painting is just not going to look good. So I try not to worry about any of those details like that until everything is actually in place. And so all I'm doing is just going for these big shapes, getting them in place, and I'll worry about the details. Well, if I do it right, I'll never have to worry about the details. There's a thing that sometimes happens where I sort of paint accidentally. Like just by focusing on these big shapes, I'll look and realize that by painting around the details, I sort of accidentally painted them in. So that's always nice when that happens. So sometimes I have to force them and include them at the end, but sometimes it's nice if I don't. For now, my mouth is a little low. There's the chin. And all I'm really doing is I'm still focusing on just like these two big shapes. So you've got the shadow area, like under the jaw, and then you've got the mid-tone where the form starts to turn. And mostly I'm just focusing on that edge, like that line in there, like even though I'm kind of jumping around, getting the relationship of the shape of the shadow with the shape of the mid-tone. I got to get that right first. You know, if those things aren't right on this fundamental level, the painting is never going to come together. And I've learned that from a lot of years of experience. This little reflected light, like you can, if you can see the photo, there's this kind of this light spot like underneath the jaw, and I think it's actually light reflecting off that bright white suit, and so it's a little reflected shadow that I kind of like. Again, see, I'm focusing on the eye socket rather than the eye. And the paint is still very thin. So for a painting like this, well, the budget for it kind of depends, because when you buy paint, you know, as whole tubes. The canvas, well, a shout out to Carol Oddie at Medusa Tattoo in Ithaca, New York, because she gave me this canvas, so she sponsored this in a way. So that didn't cost me anything. But I mean, I would say like the percentage of supplies and all that, typically, had I bought the canvas and all that, this would probably be like, I don't know, 30 bucks, maybe 30, 40 bucks, you know, of just materials. Maybe, I mean, it also depends on how easy it becomes. Like my technique is such that I will sometimes scrape a canvas and paint it again, scrape it, paint it again, over and over and over. And so those ones are going to be, like, you know, from a practical standpoint, a little bit more expensive because I'm just going through more paint. And oil paint is surely expensive. Painting out the area in that eye. I was getting too distracted by the actual eyelid that was in there. I don't need that information yet, so I was going to get it out of there. I'm trying to stay caffeinated during all this, so if I wander off for a second, that's what's happening. I'm getting my art juice. Okay, so now I'm going to paint in the highlight area, and so this is going to be the coolest flesh tone so far, so I'll maybe introduce just a tiny little bit of that blue. Let's see, how's that? Ooh, no, that's a horribly ugly color. That's the wrong color. So the colors I have on my palette right now are alizarin crimson, which is like a dark red, ultramarine blue, which is a very dark blue. I have chromium oxide green on the palette, but I don't think I'm going to use it. That was from a lesson I did yesterday. But I might. I mean, sometimes it happens. I get messy. I may or may not use it. Next I have cadmium yellow light. Then I have burnt umber, burnt sienna, ivory black, and titanium white. I considered cutting the blue entirely. Like I was considering doing a very limited palette. A sort of like a very like traditional, almost like Renaissance palette would be the alizarin crimson, the cadmium yellow light. Well, not really cadmium, but the like a yellow ochre, burnt umber, black and white. You know, very simple palette. At that point, you don't really need a blue. The black will sort of stand in as a blue. The most difficult part to paint for portraits, so anybody who's like talked to me about art for more than like 5 minutes will hear me talk about John Singer Sargent. That's my idol. He's my favorite painter who ever lived. And he also taught art, and he was sort of known for being kind of very clever, and he was very good with sort of like very rich society people. Those were mostly his patrons. But what he said, like he was asked once, what is the difference between a portrait and just a regular painting? And he said that a portrait is a painting in which there is something wrong with the mouth. And I will definitely say that the mouth is consistently one of the hardest things to paint. Partly because it's not really like a separate thing, Like lips aren't actually like a separate organ, really. There's a very subtle shift where the skin sort of protrudes and the color shifts a little bit, but there's not like a hard boundary where like the lip ends and say like the side of the mouth begins. And so it can be really hard to get it placed right. And then they have to be very, very subtle. Or else they're going to look, like glued on, like somebody's got like wax teeth in or something like that. Colors, you have to be real careful with color. If it's like somebody wearing lipstick, then it's fine. You can just make it super bright. But if you want to make it like unmade up lips, that the color is very, very subtle. Like we tend to think of lips as being like red or pink, but they're not as red or pink as we tend to perceive them. That's a little better. So as I'm going and I'm putting in this the highlight section, I'm sort of shaping around these shadow areas. Kind of painting over them a little bit, building them in. Just gonna paint right over that mouth. It'll be easy enough to do later. And even this paint is still, like I say, it's a little thinned out. All of this is going to be painted over. Again, this is just sort of almost like scaffolding. This is just the base that I'm going to put the real painting on top of. So it's okay if it's messy, as long as everything's generally in the right place. I can find it. All right, so now I've got this messy scramble of a face going on there. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to clean off my brush. And this paint that's on here that's still wet, I'm going to take this clean brush and I'm going to start reducing all this to very, very simple shapes. I'm going to start working on, I'm going to like fix the drawing by how these shapes are blended together. It's got my nice big brush and I'm going to start with the outline. So like, I know that the eye socket comes in here a little bit. It's a little bit softer of an edge, so I'm going to fix that. The jaw comes in a little tighter. And I'm starting with the outline of the face, like basically the silhouette of it, because if that part's not right, there's no point in moving on to the next step. There's sort of a process for getting a good likeness. And getting it right, getting the big shapes right and then getting the small shapes right is way easier than trying to, because if you don't get these big shapes right, then like you'll be chasing your tail being like, why doesn't this look right? Why does this look right? And fixing the nose and then just fixing the eye, and it'll never come together because a lot of times the problem is like an underlying structural problem. And that's what I'm trying to avoid. And I'm blending the paint, like the paint with the skin, just putting it right into the hair, you know, because I want that to be soft. Like the hair is sort of coming down, and then the hairline is not a hard line. It's a soft transition. So I want to keep the paint actually soft to reflect that. The actual specific border and like the individual hairs, like those are details I can worry about later when it'll be a little more useful. Comes a little lower. And so I'm softening the edges of this, trying to like get the shape sort of worked into each other, creating nice soft edges. In the early stages, you want to keep all your edges really, really soft, even if you want to have a hard edge on there later, because it's way easier to turn a soft edge into a hard edge than it is to turn a hard edge into a soft edge. Because once the paint dries and there's a little bump there, it's there for good. And with hair, hair's something I think people like struggle with quite a bit. The trick with hair is don't worry so much about it. The brush itself is made of hair. You know, it's all these little hairs on there. It's the perfect tool for making hair texture. It's already hair. Let the brush do all the heavy lifting. If you just let it be streaky and just let the brush mark in the paint, it'll look like hair. You know, and I think what happens when people like run into trouble is they start trying to like really get in there and like render it, and then it just starts looking like a soft sort of like gelatinous kind of mass, and not like individual hairs that are all moving independently and, you know, blowing in the wind or whatever. The brush will do a lot of that for you. And so I'm especially keeping the edge, like where the hair meets the background, I'm especially keeping that really soft at this point. Partly because like once I start getting start painting the face, I know from experience that it might move up a little bit, it might move down a little bit, it might move left or right. Things have a weird tendency to drift. And if I have that hair locked in and perfect, the face is going to move and it's going to look sort of weird. And honestly, the hair is like the least important part. I can finish that edge at the very, very end. I can put it where the face actually ends up being, and no one will ever be the wiser. I'm going to soften all of this down. For one-on-one lessons, you can contact me either through Facebook or you can email me at joegranski@gmail.com. I would be happy to talk about that with you. If you want to or if you know somebody who might be interested, I'd be really honored if you passed it on. Okay. So now I'm just gonna go through and just softening, like any place where there might be like an edge or a bump or like a little kind of accumulation of paint, I'm just going to soften it down. Keep it nice and vague. You know, I was talking about painting these edges into one another. So the background gets painted into the coat gets painted into the background. And that comes straight, that's advice that comes straight from John Singer Sargent. He would sometimes paint like half an inch over those edges, like paint really in there, and then go back and paint the other way, like half an inch, and he would sort of then move into the, you know, to the boundary. But he got some, just like, that's the way he got some very, very beautiful soft edges. If you ever have a chance to see Sargent in person, I can't recommend it highly enough. Okay, so now I'm going to move to a smaller brush because now I've got my general shapes in there. It's not perfect. I'm not at a point yet, like this is sort of like a milestone where it's like, well, would this person's mother recognize them from across the street? And I'm not there yet, but now I'm going to begin the process of sort of getting those features in place so it'll at least be close enough on that level. But now I'm not going to thin the paint out anymore. I'm going to use the paint at its full thickness. So before I do that, I need to clean my palette and get all this thinned out, messy paint out of my way. If anybody's interested, my palette is actually a cutting board. I bought it at Target years and years ago. Then I put a couple layers of linseed oil on it to treat it, and I've built up over the years. There's probably now a 1/4 inch or so of like accumulated paint on the surface of this thing, which is good for a palette because it's not absorbent at all. Like you want a palette, especially for oil paint, that's not gonna leach the paint or not leach the oil out of your paints. And so all these layers of oil, all these years of using it, it's like the perfect surface. All my colors are laid out in a row. Yes, I do take commissions. You can contact me through Facebook or my email, joegranski@gmail.com. I happily take commissions. I love taking commissions. A little more paint. Okay. So I have a kind of order of operations of how I sort of work. Where, like I said before, I like working background to foreground, and even though I have like those steps in now, like as I move to a smaller brush, it's still going to be background to foreground, and I'll show you what I mean. I'm starting with this very small brush, maybe 1/2 inch, something like that. And this is a Rosemary & Co. brush I got years ago, and I was so happy that I was able to restore it recently. I thought it was sort of lost. But happily, I was able to restore it. And they're expensive, but they're some of the nicest brushes I've ever used. All the like painters that I really respect and follow, like, you know, they all recommend this brand of brushes, and they are not wrong. Okay, so got myself a black that I mixed with the alizarin crimson and the ultramarine blue. And I'm just gonna loosely start fixing the outline here. You know, I'm not getting very precious about my brush strokes. I'm not worried too much about texture. I'm just getting just trying to get these shapes right. You know, and I'm sort of like narrowing in. You know, it's almost like it starts off very blurry, and then I'm sort of like comes gradually into focus. And so this is that focusing process. Like just kind of coming in a little bit more precise with the edges. Really what I'm doing is fixing the drawing. Like the secret to all this is that the hard part is drawing, and if you can draw well, then everything else is just sort of technique. But the most important part is the drawing. That's what's going to make it look like what you want it to look like. That's what's going to express whatever you're trying to express. And so what I'm doing is fixing and maybe I should also explain what I mean by drawing. I think a lot of people, especially people who aren't necessarily artists, may think of drawing as the lines I did at the very beginning. And that's a narrow definition of the word drawing. But I would use it more in the sense that the arrangement of shapes, the accuracy of the anatomy, how all that fits together. That's what I mean by the drawing. The shapes are the right size in the right place. That kind of accuracy. That's what I mean by the drawing. The brushes, it's Rosemary & Co. or Rosemary & Company. I think they're out of England, but all the brushes are handmade. And like I said, like I bought these brushes maybe 10 years ago and did not take very good care of them. And here I am. I was able to restore them, and it's still like it's a nice brush. I've been using sort of cheap brushes for a while because I'm so hard on them, and so they don't last very long. But this is very nice that this brush actually lasted. Get this shape of this jaw and the chin. That comes in a little bit more. Don't care for that. See, this is the nice thing about oil paint. You don't like it? You don't like a shape? Just wipe it off. And you can put it all on the end. It's fine. Like, the most valuable thing, like the most valuable skill I think a person could have for oil painting is let it go. Don't worry about what you did. If you painted it well, don't worry about giving it up. If you painted it well once, you can paint it well again. And if you can't paint it well again, it means it was a fluke and you don't deserve it in the first place. So I'm not precious at all. Like, I'll scrape stuff off. I'll spend 3 or 4 hours working on a portrait and being like, well, that was fine. It looks like what I want it to look like, but I had fun doing it. I'll scrape it off and just do it again tomorrow. Just because doing this is fun for me. And I guess, I mean, if somebody's doing this and it's not fun for them, what are they doing? I don't understand that at all. I'll worry about the suit later. That's the least important part of this. Okay. And so what I'm also going to do, because I'm working with the paint like that, it's fuller thickness now. I'm going to, like, even though I'm not going to paint the arrow yet, I'm going to take my brush and I've cleaned it off. I've got all, like, the pigment out. And I'm going to use the brush to sort of cut through some of the paint that I just put in there for the arrow. Because when I eventually paint that arrow in, I don't want there to be a whole bunch of, like, paint and, like, little strokes accumulated. Because if you try to paint over that, it gets bumpy and it looks weird. And it'll never quite look right. So I want to just, like, get the spot for this arrow just kind of blocked out, to basically just take down the texture of the paint so that I can then build on top of it and have it look like, you know, he's actually wearing this thing on his head. This side I'm going to use just a little bit of mineral spirits in there, and then whoop, wipe that right out. What's nice about it is, like, even though it's, you know, the apparatus that Steve Martin is wearing in this, the arrow is fairly straight. If I paint it not straight, it's only going to make the painting better. It's going to be way funnier to look at if it's a little awkward, because that was sort of the whole point of the gag, is that it's kind of dumb. You know, it's absurd. Because let me tell you, straight lines are really difficult. Especially without, like, a ruler. Okay, so I got that background in. I'm going to fix this jaw. Or not background, but I got the outline of this worked in. So I'm going to take, all right, so now I'm going to start working on my shadow areas again. Typically on portraits, I like working from the darks to the lights, from the shadow areas to the highlights. The reason for it is because I like the paint to sort of mimic what light is actually doing. You know, when light is cast on an object, the light is spread over the object. And where the shadow is, there is less light. So I like painting in a way where in the shadow areas, the paint is thin and there's less paint, and then it's built over top of those shadow areas, and then you get a thicker texture with the highlights. So I'm going to start with this is just a burnt sienna with a little bit of burnt umber, just to keep it from being too orange. I'm still using that small brush that I was using before. And I'm going to redefine sort of the important structural elements, like starting with the outline of the face, like where the jaw is, all that stuff. And I'm not going as dark as I want to go. I'll put like my dark shadows in later. I like to put that stuff in last. But I still want to get the form expressed in a way that, like, I understand what I'm looking at, the colors are right, and I'm starting to build like the shadows and making this look three-dimensional. Got that little dark spot under the chin. Tie. So, like I was saying before, this triangle in here for the brow and the nose, those eye sockets, like that's such an important part of likeness. You know, like the, and that's such a big shape, like on his face. You can see how dark it is above his eye. You know, that shape in there is going to be so much of keeping this expressive and looking like Steve Martin. I'm not worried about the eyebrow. I'll paint that in later. You know, it's easier to paint the eyebrow on top of the finished eye socket than it is to paint the eyebrow in. The only times I'll paint the eyebrow in, like, first, like to mark it, is if it's, say there's very intense light on the face and so there aren't a lot of shadow areas. I'll put the eyebrows in just as like a placeholder so that I can find my way and like my proportions a little bit easier. Just because it's like a big dark spot you can use. You know, if somebody has dark hair, or at least has dark eyebrows. Steve Martin has light hair and dark eyebrows. Upper eyelid. And even like in the nostril, I'm not going dark yet. I think that's a mistake I see a lot when people, especially when they're starting out with portraits, is making those things like nostrils and the corners of the mouth and like way too dark. And when you make those things too dark, they start looking like a cartoon because they start having that outline quality to it. In real life, it's a weird thing about outlines. Everybody draws them. Like, it's a natural thing. Like, children, when they start drawing, everybody draws outlines. Nobody's ever seen an outline in their entire lives. They don't actually exist. It's just sort of a way that we think about the world that sort of like makes intuitive sense, but is not actually reflective of what's there. You know, you have form and you have structure, but you don't have line. So block in the mouth. It's a little bit better placement. A little shadow under there. The nose comes in more. And so what I mentioned earlier, sort of like how I end up painting things by accident, so I can paint around them. So what I'm doing here is I'm painting the eye socket, like this eye socket that's sort of turned away, trying to get this angle right, coming up where the brow is. But then as a result, I've painted the bridge of the nose. You know, like I wasn't thinking about the nose as I was doing it, I was thinking about the shape of that eye socket. But then the bridge of the nose got done. And so I'm always trying to looking for opportunities to do that. I'm putting this darker color a little bit on the very edge of the face here because I know that as a form turns, it's going to get a little less distinct. So even though a lot of that paint's going to be a little bit covered up, I like having that little bit of that darker edge so I can create the illusion of like the form turning. Wow, it's been an hour already. Man, that went fast. Okay. So I'm going to start doing, I think, those midtones again. Like I said, I'm going to work my way up. Well, actually, there's a little bit lighter before I get to midtones. There's a few of those there's light areas in the shadows that I'm going to do. Take some burnt sienna, some white, some alizarin crimson. See how that looks. How's that color? It's too orangey. It's easy to fix. I see people are still sort of, I look back at my phone, I see people are popping in. Thank you, everybody who's joining me for this. I hope it's as fun for you as it is for me, because I think this is awesome. Like, I really enjoy this. So I got this color now that's sort of like, it's not a highlight, it's not exactly a shadow, it's kind of a mid-tone. But there's always going to be, like, between a shadow and a highlight, there's going to be a series of, like, iterations and stops in between there, and that's what I'm working on. And with each round of it, I'm working a little more on the drawing, reinforcing it. Under the nose, I got that shadow color. Thanks, Karen. Like, this is something I've been thinking about doing for a long time. You know, it's always been in the back of my head. It's like, man, I bet that would be fun. And finally, I guess this is a good time to try things. And yeah, this is really great. So one thing to also know about painting in general, it doesn't really matter what medium you're using. Watercolor might be a little different, but oil, acrylic, when you have a brush, you can only get one side of the brush stroke correct. So when I'm going in and, like, you put a mark down, there's two sides to that mark. You really only want to focus on one edge. In this case, I'm focusing on, like, where the hair line goes in. You can only get this one edge correctly. But so I tend to have like a way of thinking about it where I sort of work smaller and smaller and in and in and in. So the outer edge is perfect, and then when I come to paint the next one over, I reestablish that edge, and then it sort of it accumulates towards the painting. Mark the chin. Thanks, Bree. There's this, if you all haven't looked it up yet, if you can still find it on YouTube, there's this great show that I watched. It's like a BBC show. Not BBC, it's Sky Entertainment, but it's British. It's a Portrait Artist of the Year. And it's like a reality show that I can actually stand behind, because the premise of it is basically you have 3 different models set up and you have 9 artists, and they have 4 hours to do a painting of the person who's sitting for them. And it's really great. A wide variety of different techniques and styles. Like, they kind of talk about, like, why they're doing it. Like, the work is a wide range of, like, professionals and amateurs. They have, like, younger people and older people. It's a really great show. And, like, if you get a chance, if you're interested in that sort of thing, like, I highly, highly recommend it. Hey, Kirsten, how's it going? Oh, so what do you mean by using the brush up on one side? So I'll show you like an example that's really like easy to see. So when you paint a brush stroke, you've got 2 sides. There's one side here, one side there. So if there is, say, a form here, there's like an edge that I'm trying to work paint into. When I come along to fix this edge, the only side of this brush stroke that I'm focusing on is where those 2 colors meet. And then I let the other one just be whatever it's going to be, because then when I come in with my next color, I'll worry about this edge. And now both those edges have been covered, but I'm only working on one at a time. I think what happens is sometimes people get frustrated when the whole brush stroke doesn't go where they want it to. And it's way easier if you just focus on one side of it. It's the other side later. And honestly, like, if that is also kind of a little bit difficult to think about, I read that in a book years ago, an Alla Prima by Richard Schmid, and it set in the back of my head. I had no clue what he was talking about. It took me years of painting and always thinking about that in the back of my mind and sort of paying more attention to my process. But when then it finally started clicking, and then even once it started clicking, I wasn't necessarily great at doing it yet. You know, there's understanding is one thing, and then like actually acting on that understanding is a different thing entirely. So it's a good advice, but it's also it can be a little difficult. Let's see, where am I? That's too pink. It's too bright as well. I'm going to work on some of the highlight areas a little bit, just to kind of establish the form a little better. So I'm going to come with a kind of a little warmer flesh tone. Not warmer flesh tone, lighter flesh tone. It's actually going to be a little bit cooler than what I've been doing. Still a little warm. Yeah, that's pretty good. And so as I go, you can see I'm correcting, like this, extension of what I was saying about that edge, is you can see that I'm sort of like, I was working on this side with the darker color, and now I'm with the lighter color, and I'm working on this side of it. And this is not my brightest bright or my highlight, that's pretty far off. I like saving my lightest lights, my darkest darks for the very end. But also, when I was talking earlier about drawing and how important drawing is, I'm drawing with the brush. I think that's something that maybe people don't necessarily understand when I talk about how important the drawing is. Drawing with the brush, a lot of my practice drawing I did with the brush, it's just fundamentally a brush or a pencil. It's still the same kind of thing going on, where you just have a long stick in your hand and you're trying to make a mark of a certain size. So I'm refining the drawing, like things like this cheek and like the edge of the face. So when I'm talking about the drawing, that's what I mean. And there's a very sculptural quality to oil too. Like I conceive of a lot of as I'm painting these lighter shapes, looking these darker shapes, I feel like I'm almost like carving through the paint a little bit, like kind of like cutting into it. One of the things I love about oil is like the kind of texture you can get is pretty unique to oil paint. And so I like really playing with that and get like a nice varied surface. I like it to be almost like a topographic map. My little accent points, the paint will be like piled on there. Like I really love stuff that's like that. So I'm going to take a step back for just a second. It's a really important part of the process. You need to give yourself distance from your painting sometimes. My ideal setup, I used to have like a full-length mirror that I set up about 5 or 6 feet behind me, and then I could just turn around and have like a nice 10-foot distance between me and my painting. And that's really important. It's also important to look at it from different angles. So I'm going to turn it upside down for a second so I can see all of my mistakes. Sometimes that's the only way to find them is to get a different view on it. Okay. Yeah, I don't do a whole lot of blending. Sometimes I will, depending on what I'm going for. Sometimes the big shapes I'll blend. Blending is also, it's a more time-consuming process where I feel like this sort of like, a timed demo like this, letting it be kind of brushy, it's very, very quick, more alla prima. I like that a little bit better. But sometimes what I'll also do is, if I want to blend, is I'll go back at the end and do it. Like I said, I've been saying over and over, the paint just stays wet. You can get all the stuff in there, get all your shapes in, and all your details in, and then just go back in with like a fan brush or a big brush, and then just smooth everything out. You can then direct the brush strokes to go like the way you want them to go, and that's a totally fine way of doing that. But for something like this, but it's also that's not necessarily the right way of doing it. Like I think that there's all kinds of different approaches to oil, and the best advice I can give is find the one that is the most fun for you personally and do that. Find artists you like looking at, and just try to do what they did. That's too light. Thanks. And for colors also, like I said, like I do this very kind of freestyle kind of color mixing, so I don't always know if a color is going to look one way on the palette when it's sort of isolated and it's surrounded by the color of the palette, and then it's going to look completely different when I put it on the canvas next to these other colors. So a lot of times what I'll do is to see if it's the right color, I'll just take the color and I'll just put a little mark, and it's doesn't matter. I can paint over it. I can take it off if I need to, but I can then at least see the color in like the proper context, and then I can make good decisions about it. Make more naturalistic looking color. There we go. I think that ought to do it for my highlights in here. So I'm going to go through and start building like this real highlight area in the front. That's where a lot of the likeness is, I expect. Forehead. And like one of the things that can make noses difficult too is I think a lot of times people will over-define them. So for example, like a lot of people, they were doing a drawing of this, they would draw in the outline of the nose. But if you really look at that photo, you can't really see where the nose actually ends. Like those colors sort of disappear and blend into the cheek behind it. If you can't see something, don't paint it. Because if at that point, then you're just making stuff up. And if you're just making stuff up, it's going to be a lot harder to make something that's convincing. And the truth is that, as, beings with eyeballs, we're used to not always seeing things. Like, it's actually not that weird for something to be sort of, we can't see it very well, or it's unclear. If you leave things that are sort of vague and unclear in your art, it'll actually reflect more like actual vision, like how vision actually works. Things that are too defined are going to look cartoony or fake or photoshopped. So if you're working from a photo reference especially, if you can't see it, don't paint it. And even though I'm using a smaller brush, I'm still focusing on like these big shapes. So as I'm going through, like, and I'm painting around like the cheek and the forehead, I'm thinking of like this whole thing of like the forehead and then the cheek. I'm thinking of it as all as like one basic shape. And as I'm going through, I'm just painting the outline of that shape, like just the boundary of it. And sometimes it breaks into like smaller sub-shapes, but the trick is to go from really, really big shapes and just work smaller and smaller and smaller and like zoom in on them. And then those final little small shapes are like the accent points, and that's where you're going to have like a nice texture, or maybe like a nice dash of color or something. Just going to paint in the white of the eye. So here's the thing about whites of the eyes. They are never, ever white, under any circumstances. Doesn't matter what kind of lighting they're under, doesn't matter, like, unless it's so much light being flooded into it that you can't see it all. The whites of the eyes are never white. At best, they're gray. Like, if you were to like zoom in and look at somebody's eye, you'd see that color is gray. But in terms of painting, the color that you want to use for the whites of the eyes is basically the same color that you're using for the flesh tone of the cheek around it, but just a little bit grayer. Like whether you put a little bit of blue in there or a little bit of black, but just a little bit of a grayer color. But a sure way to kill the likeness or like the realistic look of a painting is to get those whites bright white. And then again, you run into that cartoony problem. I'm going to put in a couple of darks here. It's not the very end, but I can put a few dark spots, like maybe the eyebrow. This is a good time to put it in, especially since we're already at an hour and 20 minutes. I'd like to get this to some level of some kind of completion. I feel like it'd be really unsatisfying to watch me not finish a painting tonight. Wow, that is creepy looking. That is really weird looking. Sometimes, like, there's a few stages where the things look kind of bizarre. It'll be worked out later, but that is weird. But it's expressive at least. Like, definitely like some really expressive eyes jumping out. It's also a nice thing about painting like a comedy icon is it can just be goofy and weird, and that's totally okay. That will even make it better. Let's get the upper eyelid line in there. And I'm still using this same brush. Another piece of advice from John Singer Sargent, always use a brush one size larger than you think you need, because that will keep you from focusing on the tiny details before you're ready. But of course, I'm exactly focusing on tiny details as I'm saying that exact thing. So, you know, do as I say, not as I do, I suppose. I'm just sort of... This is a little bit of blending, but it's mostly just sort of tweaking the drawing. There's places where it's imperfect, and so I want to just refine it a little bit. Like, I don't want to overdo it. The danger with this kind of thing is like you could overwork it and then it all turns into like a very uniform kind of grayish mass, and so we don't want that. But I can still come in here and sort of sculpt this a little bit. That comes in more. It's not quite Steve Martin yet, but he's in there. I feel him close. Yeah, so I'm going to go through. And so like I talk about reducing things to like their simple shapes. And that's what I'm doing now with this. I'm still doing it with this same brush, but I'm getting all the pigment out of the brush, cleaning it off. And then I'm going to play with this paint, and I'm going to reshape things. Soften this mouth because it's not really correct. So to paint the bottom of the nose, for example, I'm not painting the nose or the shadow. I'm painting the shape of the cheek behind it. And that will create the bottom of the nose for me. So I'm still painting along that edge, but I'm using the color of the cheek, and that will build the nose for me. The painting in the corner, so this one here is Douglas Adams, and this one over here is Alan Watts. His nose comes out way more than I thought. There we go. That's better. Well, thank you, Tracy. That would be very nice. I would love that. Through both Cash App and PayPal, I'm under joegranski@gmail.com. That's very kind of you. Thank you. I'm going to soften these eyes a little bit. They're not exactly in the right place, and I can feel myself. You know, part of the advice I give about not focusing on the eyes and all that sort of thing, that advice comes from knowing my own weaknesses, and I know that if I let myself go, I'm going to hyper-focus on those eyes. And so, you know what, just get rid of them. Then I can't worry about them, and I can worry about all the stuff that's around them, which will make a better painting. It's interesting how much you can get away with not painting sometimes. Like if you go and see some Renaissance paintings, like Rembrandt or something like that, and if they have like a 3/4 view where like part of the face is in shadow, like one of the eyes is in shadow, the really great painters, they didn't paint both eyes. Stuff that's in shadow, like they put kind of a vague shape. They didn't put any detail, and like so they maybe would paint one eye that's in like the highlight, but your brain seeing that one eye and then seeing just the vague sort of impression of the other eyes will just fill that information, and then you'll be totally convinced that you see an eye there when it's not even painted. And so I've got kind of the larger areas in of like the lights and the shadows. I kind of know where that's like the likeness isn't perfect, but the stuff is in approximately the right spot. So now I'm just going to kind of like jump around. It's a little less like formulaic of like working from light to dark or dark to light. And I'm just going to kind of whatever little spot that I think needs the work. That's what I'm going to focus on. Like there's some sort of pinky, shadowy kind of areas that I think need a little bit of addressing. So that's what I'm going to do right now. There we go, I like that. We've got these reflected kind of light areas, the really warm flesh tones that are in these shadows. And let me tell you, if you really want to make something look like airy and like really looks like realistic, if there are reflected shadows, like reflected light, those things are subtle, but if you get them right, it makes a huge difference in sort of what like the kind of the emotional content or sort of the mood of the painting. And it's a very subtle thing that we don't often think about. But you know, reflected light, I mean, it can be a little challenging, but when it works really well for like looking like realism and for making a convincing image. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate. I appreciate even people just being here at all. So anything that you do beyond that, like I'm so thrilled. Thank you very much. So one of the things that makes mouths difficult is, for one thing, we're not used to seeing them still. You know, even if somebody is like sitting quietly, their mouth is not still for very long. They're breathing, they lick their lips, you know, whatever they do. So when a mouth looks still, if it's a little bit off and if the drawing is a little bit imperfect, it becomes really, really clear that there's something wrong. So I tend to kind of block it in a little bit and then paint around it and then come back and change a little bit. And the final version of the mouth is typically one of the last things I do. So now I'm going to go just a little bit lighter with a round of highlights. A little bit lighter, a little bit different color. Like I part of like, you know, this, why I do such freestyle color mixing also is, I think that if you use exactly the same colors like over and over again, I think it can be very stiff. Whereas little variations in color where the ratios change a little bit here and there, looks, I mean, it's similar to what the Impressionists would call like broken color. But having little variations of color in these little spots, like I find that to be so much more beautiful in a painting. And so I don't like to just have, like, say, a flesh color and then I just add more white for a little bit of highlighter, then a little more white for another highlight. I like remixing the color, remixing the ratios. Maybe there's a little more red in this one, maybe there's a little more blue in this one. And if you have a limited palette, like you're just using the same, you know, 5 or 6 colors, 7 or 8 colors, you never really have to worry about color harmony. That stuff is going to happen all by itself just by the fact that you're using the same colors. So, like, letting out those little variations stay in there is only going to help the painting. So I'm just going to put the highlights in there and reshaping everything as I go. And just like, because there's light shining through the hair, I'm just going to put just little streaks in there. And like, they don't have to exactly match the photo, they don't have to be perfect, but just that'll help create the look that there's light like actually shining through it. Thank you. I mean, so with a 2-hour demo, it's highly unlikely that I would get like a perfect likeness. You know, to get a really just accurate likeness of a person, it's mostly a matter of time, drawing, correcting your mistakes. But for this, it doesn't have to be quite as perfect. Like this can be a little bit more fun. So I tend to use flat brushes. Like I've used all kinds of different brushes, but I tend to use flat ones. And the reason for it is I like the variety of marks a flat brush can make. You know, because it's like a brush, so it's, you know, it's got that shape to it, but it's also sort of thin. So you can make a stroke that's sort of like that. You can make a thin line. You can make a thin line and like use like a calligraphy pen and sort of like twist it as you go. And I find that the square brushes have like kind of the most variety of marks. Like that's what I tend to prefer. Like I can use the rounds and filberts and all that, and I'll use filberts for sort of softer stuff, but square brushes are what I use more than anything else. Well, is it starting to look like him? Sometimes it's hard to tell on my end. You know, like I get so used to it. Like this is a problem with portrait painting, is that like you can get so used to looking at the thing that it starts looking familiar, and even if it's wrong, the familiarity will make me think that it's correct. So sometimes I feel like I lose whether or not it even looks like the person. So I'll take your word for it. Thank you. I may be at a point where some of these things, like the mouth, I may have to switch to a smaller brush. So I may have like hit the maximum threshold of like, or minimum threshold, I guess, of what these brushes can do. Like there's only like, you can get a lot out of a square brush. You can get some thinner marks, but there does come to a point where there's just, you can't get any smaller. And I may be getting pretty close. I like to be as close to that point as possible before moving on. So I'm glad that everybody joined me for this. People who stayed for a little while, people who came in late, people who have been here for the whole thing. Like, thank you to everybody. I was a little nervous about this. You know, it's my first time doing a sort of streaming thing. I'm feeling pretty good about it. I love an opportunity to share this stuff with people. My two favorite things, doing art and talking about art. This is a nice way of scratching both those itches. I'm gonna move to a little bit smaller brush now. Well, actually, I think a lot smaller brush for the moment. I'm gonna go back to this tiny little thing that this is what I did my initial drawing with, but for some of these details, and since we're coming close to the end here, you can at least put some details in with this. Also, as I mentioned, I'm doing one-on-one teaching. I'm available for commissions. The teaching has been going really well. Like I've figured out a way to get to do it online that I think works really nicely. So if anybody's interested, or if you know anybody's interested, please send them my way. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Kirsten. I'm glad you all stopped by. You can send it to me either Cash App or PayPal, joegranski@gmail.com. JoeGranski. Thank you very much. I'm fussing way too much with these eyes. Like I said, I know my weaknesses. There we go. It's hard to get the eye right if the eye socket is not correct. You know, the chin or the jaw or like the cheek rather is a little bit off. Then if the brow is just a little bit off, like the cumulative effect of that will be that nothing lines up properly. And so if you can find those little mistakes, find those little like trouble areas, change them as soon as you can. Otherwise, you're going to be chasing your tail for however long it takes. So even though the invite said I was going to go from 7 to 9, I may go a little bit longer. If people are still here interested in watching, if you're not, I'll probably just continue to paint just without the internet involved. But while I'm doing it, if y'all are still interested, I'll go a little bit longer. Wow, I got that totally wrong. That line is straight up and down, and I painted it going outward. The finishing touches, it sort of depends on the piece. For something like this, like finishing touches would be things like the arrow or something like that. Yeah. But I doubt I'll get to that tonight. That's part of the reason why I left all the area nice and thin and cleaned that paint out. So if it dries a little bit overnight, that's totally fine. Any kind of like final highlights and final shadows, those are always going to be my sort of finishing touches. If there's a really intense color accent, that'll be one of the last things I do as well. And anybody who's been here like for a while now, you'll notice how many times like I paint a thing and then I paint over it and I go back and I paint it again. That is all part of the process, and that's really the power of oil paint. Like that is the thing that allows like such beautiful artwork to come from oil. It's because you can just go back and you can fix it and you can be a perfectionist and it'll stay wet and you can manipulate it as much as you want. I think people get really intimidated by oil because it has a kind of prestige about it, but in some ways it's easier than something like acrylic because it just stays wet. You might be able to pull this video up tomorrow. I'm not sure. I don't know if I'm recording it. I'm not quite sure how to do that. If there is a copy of it, I mean, yeah, that'd be great. Thanks for coming by though, Tracy. I'm glad you could visit. I definitely am gonna start recording, like doing actual like demo, like more like longer demo videos and putting them up on the internet for people. I want to do chats like this, like these sort of like live streams, like a kind of somewhat frequently. Like this has been really fun, and if people are still interested, I'd be happy to do more of them. Thank you. Thanks for coming by. I enjoyed it as well. Have a good night. Thanks for coming. Now, if I wasn't doing this as like a time demo, if I was just working on this, like say if it were commission, or if it was something that like didn't have a deadline, one of the things I would have done a bunch at this point is you would have seen me like reduce this to simple shapes over and over and over again. It's how you kind of zoom in on a likeness. It's how you get it to really look right, but it is time consuming. So this is a little wilder, a little less refined. There's that reflected shadow I was talking about under there, right under the jaw. Not reflected shadow, but just reflected light. So who's still here? I can't, like, I was looking at the chat view. I can see it looks like there's 4 people in here, but I'm not sure who are there. Say hi. Who's watching? Hello. Hello, Kelly. Hello, Kirsten. And I guess is Jim's with you too? Hello, Jim. Hello, Becca. I'm putting just like the lightest highlights yet, and just a few spots like around the chin and on the jaw. That is too light for right there. So it is just about 9 now, so I'll probably go to about like 9:15 or 9:20 maybe. Unless everybody bails by then. Good night, Kirsten. Thanks for coming. Love you too. Man, this corner of the eye in here, man, that's a part that'll really give you trouble. Like just right in the corner of the eye. I feel like his face is looking a little bit narrow. Like I think it's like I talked at the very beginning about how sometimes things will like drift and change, and I think the face is sort of like drifted to the left a little bit. So before I go any further, I want to fix some of those things. So I'm going to take a bigger brush. I'm going to take this one here. It's like maybe 3/4 of an inch. And I'm gonna reduce this to some of like the simpler shapes, which is a little stiff. I can unstiff it. There we go. Let's take it back to like very, very simple shapes. And it's gonna like, from the outside, this like may appear like I'm wasting all this work that I did. But honestly, this is how you, like, this process of reducing it to simple shapes and painting for a while and reducing it back to simple shapes, like that's really how you get a nice likeness. That's how you get it to be accurate. And it's just a matter of like being willing to take the time, not being too precious about the work you've done, you know, being willing to sacrifice maybe a part that's nicely painted for like an overall better painting. And as I reduce to these simple shapes, I'm trying to follow the form a little bit, like as if I were drawing the brush actually across that face, like if Steve Martin were actually sitting here. I like to keep my brush strokes to keep going along those same direction as the form. It's like on the forehead here where, you know, there's like those wrinkles, you know, it's sort of horizontally, so I want my brush strokes to go a little more horizontally. And this process, like the darks lighten up, the lights darken a little bit, like it sort of gets a little bit closer to neutral. But that's okay, because then when I come back with my next round of like smaller colors on top of it, that I can build the highlights and the shadows up again, but it'll have like a strong foundation underneath it. So I'm going back, like not even thinking about the eye really, but I am redoing the eye socket and making the eye socket look right. All this wet paint, I can move it around. So also, like, if I wanted to do like a painting over like multiple sessions, this reducing to simple shapes would be an important part of that process as well. Because like what I want, if I come back like tomorrow or in a couple days and the paint dries on me, I don't want there to be a real bumpy texture. Like I want it to be nice and smooth. And so going through and like reducing to these simple shapes, smoothing the paint out, that's going to get me to like for my next session where it's going to be a nice surface I can work on, be nice and smooth, and the paint will take to it really nicely. There goes that mouth. And so for preparing for like another session, which is mostly what I'm doing now, I'm kind of softening these edges so I can go back, say tomorrow or some other day, paint it again. So I'm getting rid of all the bumps. Like get everything nice and soft, nice and smooth. Fix the drawing as much as possible. You know, and if it's not wasted work, you know, it's all part of what it takes to build this thing. And like I said earlier, I don't get too precious about it because like anything I did once, like anything I painted once, I can paint it again. little purpley. It's okay. Who doesn't like purple? Going back to these very simple shapes. So, like, so I was, for reducing to these simple shapes, what I'll say, like, I feel like the likeness now that I got rid of all those details and that I've simplified things out, like, I think the likeness now is closer than it was. And that's sort of like a point I was making, where it's like, if these big shapes aren't right, it is never going to look like that person. And so spending all of one's time working on these shapes, getting these right, that's how you get to a nice likeness. And things have definitely, as I predicted at the beginning, things have shifted and moved on me a little bit. That's why I like to keep this stuff nice and vague. So now I have to readjust the jacket a little bit. So I'm just going to soften this out, get it kind of approximately where it is. But if there's a nice soft edge on there, it'll be no problem going back and like painting over that with something a little more specific or a little more defined. A lot of times what I'll do at the end of a session is I'll scrape. I'll just like take a palette knife and just scrape the paint off. Like, I don't scrape really hard, but by kind of scraping gently and then smoothing it off, it's like it gets rid of all that excess paint on the surface, but it keeps like a nice perfect map of the piece that I can go back to later. And then it doesn't have any of the bumps, any of like the paint like texture that might like stop me up with subsequent layers. Yes, I will absolutely show the final product once it's done. It may not be tonight, but I'll probably finish it over the next couple days, and I'll put it on. I'll put it up on Facebook. Let everybody see it. Thanks for coming. I'll be stopping here in just a second. Like, once I get this thing reduced to the sort of the simple shapes for another session, then I think I'm gonna call it a night. Okay, well, I think that is about what I'm going to get done tonight. I know that seemed really weird where I did all these details and took them out, but now what I've got is I've got a perfect surface for when I come back in. Like these details that I have in there are pretty much where I want them. The nose could probably be a little lower. But I can come back in like with a new layer of paint, and I can like really, just start back in where I left off, and I've got these nice shapes already underneath there. So I just want to say to those of you who are left, thanks for coming. I really appreciate the support. I had a blast. I will post the final product when I'm done. And if you are interested in commissioning a piece, or if you want to take any kind of lessons in drawing or painting, whether oil painting or other kinds of paint, let me know. You can email me at joegransky@gmail.com, or you can contact me through Facebook. So have a good night, everybody, and hopefully I'll see you soon. I want to do this semi-regularly, so maybe I'll see you next time. So good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.